All right, so sacroiliac stiffness, sacroiliac pain. Let's talk about it. So it's this area here. It's kind of the center of your pelvis at the back, okay? And sometimes it can feel like it's a bit more down towards the tailbone, and then sometimes it can feel like it's a bit more, a little bit more out to the sides of the sacrum. Essentially, what this part of your pelvis is a connection point for a certain amount of nutation and counter nutation, or so basically your pelvis can rotate. If these were the two crests of your pelvis, they can rotate a little bit. The SI joint is one of the points where that movement is connecting. The SI joint, if you think about it, is also the base of the lumbar spine, and a lot of the gluteal muscles, which are big, powerful muscles, are connected around this area as well. So essentially what we're looking at is an area of a lot of force. There's also a lot of innate stiffness in the SI joint. It needs to be stiff because it's such a joining point in the body. So it often seems weird when we get this clunky feeling, or we get these clicks, or we get this sense of instability. What's going on there? So usually what's happening is that there's a lot of tightness in the glutes, and the glutes are external rotators mainly, as well as hip extensors, okay? So if you are stuck in a little bit of external rotation, and if these muscles, which grip into your SI joint at the back, if they're kind of locked and they're not really allowing great movement, then you're either going to have to find that movement through your lower back or through your SI joint. And the deeper you force hip flexion, so like the deeper you go into a squat, if they're kind of tight and you don't, maybe your pelvic control could be a bit better and you're just kind of going down there with load, or if you're working into adduction, so bringing the leg into the midline and out, or even abduction, so some variations of side planks and all of that. If you're applying high forces that you're not used to stabilizing through all of these deep central midline structures, the pelvic floor and the lower abs, inner thighs, then the SI joint just kind of takes some of that force. So the best thing you can do is to start to free up these outer hips, okay? To free up some hip flexion, to free up some internal rotation. So if the glutes are external rotators and that shortens them, then when we go into internal rotation, so external, internal, these fibers are being lengthened. And when they're lengthened via internal rotation, we feel that kind of coiling, stretchy length in the back outside of the glutes. So if I was to stand here, and I'm going to bring my right chest across my body and my head across my body and keep the knee there, then I'm going to be feeling into that coil. There's also going to be a little bit happening around the inner thigh and hamstring, which you'll sometimes feel. So the ability to rotate the pelvis over the femur like this is synonymous with internal rotation, or it's kind of like this movement if I were to do it open chain, okay? So this is open chain, the leg's free, it's this movement. This is closed chain. It's still the same movement happening between the pelvis and the hip. It's just that now I'm connected to the ground, so the pelvis is the thing that's moving freely instead of the hip. Either way, we're getting length in the back. We're getting a little bit more control in shortening the inside, so the adductor. We're controlling the pelvic orientation. And so these are all really good for improving SI joint issues, pelvic control, getting some stretch and strength into the glutes in internal rotation, and then just not overloading and bottoming out in squats, or overloading suddenly in variations of side planks. Anytime there's a demand for high levels of pelvic stability, either in this plane, which is the sagittal plane, or in the transverse plane, or in the frontal plane, anytime those stability demands are high and we have to connect our legs to our body, the SI joint is going to be like transmitting a lot of force, okay? So if your lower back is tight, of course, and your glutes are tight, well then your pelvis is really the only thing in between the two. So the other thing we can work on is control of this section between rib cage and pelvis. And the main thing we want to be looking for is, like, if we know that bottoming out a squat and kind of crunching into the hip joints or going a bit deeper than we can control is going to aggravate the SI joint, then we can, by extension, know that if we control this well, and if we have a good rib-pelvis connection, and we're aware of our depth, then we can start to work through ranges where we're not bottoming out, where we're actively controlling our balance and force application the whole time. That means you're giving your hips a little bit of play at the end. You're not going to go all the way to 100% depth if you've got SI joint issues. You're going to work with like 80, 90%, and you're really going to feel out your spine and pelvic position at the bottom, as well as the rotation of your hips. Okay? So spine, hip rotation, pelvic control, they all relate, they all go together. And when we free up the hips through control of the hips, we free up the spine through control of the spine, we also support the SI joint to not need to just cop whatever's being sent through that point in the body. What's another example here? So the SI joint, when the hips are at the edge of their range in this kind of thing, you're more likely to feel it, right? When the glutes are at the end of their range of pulling and shortening, but we still ask for more range, you're likely to feel it. So one of the things you can work with for SI joint issues is supple hip movements, where you're learning to kind of release the hip and let the hip move, and you're learning how much the hip has available to it without the pelvis doing a whole lot. Okay, so we're learning to sort of isolate hip from pelvis to a degree. What does hip feel like? What does pelvis feel like with a hip hike? What does spine feel like? Okay? If you know these points of movement independently, then you're going to be able to look at yourself doing something like a side plank raise, like this, or a Copenhagen, so it's the inner thigh that's working, or something like this. And you're going to have an idea when you watch that movement and when you feel that movement, what is moving and what is not moving. So you can cross-reference your idea of like, what am I trying to train? Is it my inner thighs? Is it my obliques? With the actual thing that's moving. It wouldn't really make sense for me if I was training my inner thighs to be the prime mover, then this needs to be, the inner thigh needs to be doing most of the movement. So my hand is here to show you that my trunk is not doing a lot, okay? It's stabilizing isometrically. It's not that my inner thigh is stuck and I'm side flexing. That would make my oblique the prime mover. Okay, so let's tie this together. Bottoming out in a movement, not having full control of the joint position in space and applying loads you're not quite ready for. That's something that could aggravate an SI joint, not because you have an issue with yours, but because that could potentially aggravate anyone's SI joint if there was even the slightest bit of weakness there. The next thing, other than bottoming out in the joints or applying load too quickly in a program that you haven't prepared for with strength and control through these parts, the next thing is you need to look at control of the pelvis, both tucking, like posterior, anterior, and hip hike type stuff. How much control do I have? And that's going to reveal to you as well how much control you have over your hips and glutes. Because the muscles that are helping me to dip down and lift up, and then drop down and lift this way, they're in the sides of the hip. So often the sides of the hip get really tight, and working through more range in internal rotation and letting our weight shift, getting into this kind of angle like a curtsy squat, that's another example of how we can really work into that. This kind of movement and this kind of control is often where we get a lot of gains in the SI joint world. When you look at this, you can also see that if I were to make this closed chain movement an open chain movement and focus on the right hip, look at the angles of my body, what we would be creating would be this, okay? Something like this. So when I'm doing it on the ground, I'm feeling these tissues getting long and strong and trained. When I'm lifting my leg, I'm feeling the inner thigh, the external rotators, as opposed to the outer thigh and the internal rotation stretch. So by training this kind of stuff, I'm also developing more fluency around my hips And that hip fluency and understanding of where my pelvis is relative to my hips is going to help me to avoid further SI joint issues. One of the things that can flare my SI joints up is if I'm spending too much time in like a deep cross-legged position or something like a pigeon stretch, but I'm not actively controlling it. So, you know, if I just sit and I'm meditating a lot and I'm doing a lot of cross-legged stuff and I'm not active in my hips, I'm just kind of at the end of my range, whatever that is, that chronic external rotation length in certain tissues, or just being a little bit almost stuck in external rotation, doing a lot of external rotation, that can kind of destabilize a little bit through the SI joint sometimes. Something else that can do that is the Taylor's pose. It's a popular one in gymnastics training. So this kind of movement where we're working into either a hold, some people call it butterfly as well, or you could have weights on your legs and you're sitting against a wall usually, and you're squeezing up and coming down. The reason that that could be more aggravating for an SI joint is because you're already in deep hip flexion, so you might kind of be bottoming out already in a sense and wedging yourself against the wall. Wedging is something that can trigger an SI. And the other thing is you're at the end of your hip range, you're at the end of your hip rotation by the nature of the movement. So again, bottoming out, going to end range without the requisite control, loading up the end range without the muscular control means that the ligaments and connective tissues around the pelvis are going to be the things that are bearing the brunt of the loading. So everything that I've shown you is about understanding bone positions, joint positions. How much space do I have left in my joints? And how much control do I have over the relationships between those joints around the hip? So to sum up, if I were to leave you with just some really simple general rules for 2 movements that are going to benefit this, the first one would just be this, like a curtsy step, which can be turned into something like a bit of a cross-reaching hinge, or can be turned into a bit of a dragon squat, but it's getting the length and the internal rotation where I'm wrapping towards this length in the coil. That's the one key. And the second key would be to really control your squats, looking at pelvic position, controlling the rib-pelvis relationship, not arching and then just getting jammed in, but actually controlling and having a slightly more yielded posture. Yielding meaning that we're opening up the space in our joints to allow deeper motion, and controlling that pelvic tilt all the way down. And then if I was doing it with a lot of weight and I wanted to train heavy back squats or front squats, but I'm having that SI joint issue, then for a while, maybe I'll use a box. I'll squat down to a box so that I'm not bottoming out. I'm gonna get used to that. I'm gonna get strong there. I'm gonna become more aware of my pelvis by feeling the way it touches the box. And even in a horse stance, something like this, I then need to be aware of like, where is my bottom out point versus my active, stretchy, supple point. And I'm going to be spending more time claiming that range, understanding my anatomy in that range, okay? So I hope this has been really helpful. I'm moving through it quite quickly. Yeah, comment below if you have any further questions, if you want me to make any more videos on a specific issue. And I'm going to be sending this to the people in my group training program as well, where we're going through a 12-week process of reducing pain, reducing restriction, dropping into more body awareness, and building strength, flexibility, movement freedom. So yes, links in description for more of my work. Much love.